All right. Okay, well, let's pray and we'll begin. Oh God, what sits in the stillness of this moment is wanting to prepare ourselves to be with you, to be with each other. There's things that we hope in a time of study and in a time of fellowship and communication. Obviously, we want to pray for knowledge. We want to pray for learning, but we want it more to be. We want it to be more than just what we might learn or something that we didn't know or something that we have forgotten. What we're after is a type of knowledge that leads to change, that leads to transformation. So that will involve reflection. It's one thing to learn, it's something else to learn and then to make application. And in order for that to happen, we have to be open and we have to be willing to allow what we do learn to be mapped into our lives, into our DNA, who we are. And so that's harder. And so in that whole process of how we grow and how we learn and how this plays a part in your Spirit's work that leads to transformation and wholeness, we want to receive that and we want to be patient with it and we also want to be faithful with it. And so in all of that, we ask for your presence this morning. These requests that we have mentioned and also the many others, and with a group this size, it would be thousands of people that we carry in our hearts, situations, concerns. Some of them are for ourselves, some of them are for family members, some of them for our friends who are like family, and then just situations in general that that are burdens. We want to, the word I heard this week of God is we want to catapult them into your presence. Because there's at times that's all we can do. And we ask that in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, we're in this third ascent, Exodus chapter 19. Yeah, I know it. 1 minute, not even a whole minute. Exodus chapter 19 is a pivotal chapter. I mean, it's a chapter that begins the second section of the book of Exodus. And so if you're looking at the layout of it, the people have reached Sinai, the children of Israel have reached Sinai, and there's a lot compacted in these 25 verses because you have three ascents or three journeys up and down the mountain by Moses, and up until then, the only person of any substance that had any type of entry into the presence of God was Moses. Aaron a little bit, but here you actually have the image of God on the mountain, and so the people now, for the first time, are getting exposed to that. And so there's a lot in chapter 19 that's, 19, 20, 21, 22. I mean, those are very pivotal chapters because inside just a small amount of text, you have actually 3 to 4 different journeys back and forth. And all of them have a different purpose. Now, we ended last week on the second ascent, and obviously that had to do more with the people being called to holiness and their willingness to accept that portion of the covenant. And then when we pick it up in verse 16 this morning, actually if somebody would read 16 through 25, that would be very helpful. Chapter 19. All right.
On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, Go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. The Lord replied, Go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them.
Okay, thank you. In this, the third ascent, you go a little bit deeper into dealing with God's holiness. Now they've come up with some parameters, some levels of offense, at least a contained area for them not to go. And you have the priest, or at least Aaron, being invited into the process now in dealing with God's holiness. Moses and the priests were made aware of some of the intensity, the awesome intensity and seriousness of the holiness of the Lord. And, one of the questions that I ask out of the text is, how can wanting to be close to God be a bad thing? Because you have this repetitive, in Hebrew and Greek, they don't have a way to set off anything like we do with bold or all caps or anything like that. And so in order to stress something, they either use something like double negatives or they use restatement. And so you have the restatements that show up inside of this passage, this little third ascent, is obviously the mountain is trembling. And it talks often about some level of description of God being on the mountain. Fire, smoke, thunder, lightning. And there's constant warnings of the people, don't go up and touch the mountain. So one of the questions we might ask is, did they want to touch the mountain?
Probably.
Maybe, okay. It's kind of like when we see a car wreck, we always turn and, we rubberneck it and it normally hit somebody in front of us. But, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, we don't know. But there's obviously warnings to not do it, and there's multiple warnings. And so again, the question before us would be, one of the questions we might ask out of this is, why the constant warning? Okay, maybe they did want to go to the mountain, but how can wanting to be with God, that would be their intention, right? Wanting to be close?
Curiosity.
Okay, maybe it's curiosity, okay. Maybe it's something more.
Maybe it's prestige.
Okay, hang on. Go ahead.
It's like the apple and the Garden of Eden.
Right.
If he hadn't mentioned it, they
Yeah.
would be consumed.
Okay, well, the warning is don't touch it because you will be consumed.
Because it was fire.
Right.
That I would have wanted to go there.
Well, yeah, there probably were some that said, "Ooh, this is too much for me," But one of the things I want us to think about is normally if you have a good intention and you do something wrong, that still can be okay, right? Maybe sometimes, right? Well, let me give you a good example. Sometimes you can have, if you have good intentions, you can do something that really is wrong, but it's okay. I had a friend of mine that his wife went and took these cooking classes, and so for their anniversary, he bought her these fantastic pots and pans. They were at the top of the line. Spent thousands of dollars, tons of money on these pots and pans, and she was irate, and he didn't know why, because his intention was, it was pure. It was, he was proud. His wife had, she had just finished, like 6 months of cooking school. And so, that would be pretty fantastic, hey, wonderful. Yeah, but it didn't work out that way. And so,
She probably handled the budget.
well, that really wasn't an issue for them. Her response were, did you not hear that I wanted these outdoor chairs? So But, and he thought he was doing really good because, not being prompted, and to go and do something out of love and care. I mean, so at what point is intention okay? And then at what point is intention just not and good enough?
Well, maybe at this point, they weren't ready to be close enough.
Well, maybe not, because one of the things that we've noticed over the first two ascents is that they were told to consecrate themselves and to make themselves ready. In the second ascent, we know that they did that by washing their clothes, and there was some level of where, and that's a Old Testament heart thing. There was also some level of abstinence. Then and here they were told to make themselves ready a number of different times, consecrate themselves. But even in putting fences or some level of blockage, physical blockage, where they can't touch the mountain, and in consecrating themselves. I mean, what does he say in verse 23? Set limits around the mountain to consecrate it. Also he says in verse 22, also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. So there are some levels of making themselves ready. Now, we might assume that also has to deal with heart, physical activity with an outward physical activity can have a heart component to it. But if there is at least some level of people wanting to go to the mountain, and maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's legitimate. They want to go to the mountain so that they can be in the presence of God. But even when the intention is good, they are still warned not to do it. Why? Okay, so we got obedience. Okay, could be obedience. Is this a universal rule where, for instance, like John Wesley would talk about holiness of heart and life, and he would define perfection in terms of love, which means that it's not absolute perfection. But if you are loving, and if you have the best intentions, if you're pure in that aspect, then even if you do something wrong by the pots and pans, it's still okay. All right? When it comes to relationships, things of that nature, at least from this text, I'm not sure that would be true. Because here, even if the heart desires to be with God, they are strictly told it doesn't matter. Do not touch the mountain.
Like the Pope in Cuba, and the man went up to him to be blessed. Of course, the security guards had a fit.
Right. So, all right.
His intentions were good.
Right. So what happened to him?
He got hauled away.
Yes, okay. So that's a perfect example. I don't think it's a universal rule. I think this is this is contextual. And the difference is God Himself is on the mountain. And so when you look at some other places, like in the New Testament, Matthew 15, I think that's one, where Jesus is critiquing how they worship. They're doing the worship right in Matthew 15, but He says, your heart's not right because, in vain do you worship me. You say all the right things, you do all the right things, you're washing the pots the right way, but your heart's not there. So obviously in Matthew 15, Jesus is talking about your intent. And so here, intent might be good or pure or holy, but if you touch the mountain, you're going to die. So it's not just intent alone, or is it just intent alone and follow through with the physical action? Or is this just something that is here in the text because God is on the mountain and it doesn't matter how pure your thoughts are, you're dealing with the utter holiness of God and there's no way that humanity can stand in the utter holiness of God? Okay.
Don't we still have things, say, in the church that we would say would be, I don't want to say off limits to a layperson, like the altar and things like that, things that are considered very holy?
Well, how many of you, along those same lines, how many were brought up, and if you're in altar guild or you had to wear gloves? Did y'all have to do that?
I had to wear them in the Baptist church.
Well, two of the churches I served, you could not touch the altar and the crosses or the candles or anything without gloves on. And the idea was it's been consecrated for God. You wouldn't just leave a fingerprint on it. I mean, it was a symbolism behind it all. And but we have other times in the Bible where intent is enough. Okay. For instance, the lady with the blood issue reaches out and touches Jesus. Well, you just didn't do that if you were a female in that day. You didn't go out and touch another man, particularly a man you did not know, in public area. That was a breaking of a social custom, a ceremonial law. Didn't matter, robe, person. You just I mean, there's no difference between people and clothing. It would be, if I go and touch Linda, if I touch her sweater, it's like me touching her. And but she does. So she breaks a law to touch, but her intention's good enough. And so Jesus turns, and obviously she's healed. There are times where the children of Israel are crossing the river, and the ark gets ready to fall, and one of the holders reaches up off the pole and touches the ark, and he dies. Well, that sounds pretty cruddy, doesn't it? All right. My intention is I don't want the ark to fall, but I was told don't touch it, so I touch it. Well, I die. Intention here could be good, but yet don't touch the mountain. I'm arguing that intention normally is enough, except for what makes this not the case is that God's literal presence is on the mountain, and that's a different deal.
Was fear something programmed to the people? Was the fear of God?
I mean, I'm not sure. That'd be a great question to ask, and we could do some further studying of other examples whenever the presence of God is there. I would think that there is a level of fear that shows up in this because this is utter holiness. Some of you even said, gosh, if I see this on the mountain, I don't know if I want to go there. You don't have to worry about putting a fence up for me. I'm going to be in my tent.
Somebody told me God is out there, and you can go out there to see Him. I wouldn't get up and go.
Yeah. Well, y'all remember your favorite book, The Problem of Pain? You remember that book that y'all love so much? There's a part in there in the chapter 1 where it talks about the nubius. If someone told you there's a ghost in the other room, you might have fear. And he says, but what about if there's God or utter holiness in the other room? It moves beyond just the normal fear of being afraid. It moves to what he called the awe. I mean, I'm paralyzed. I can't move. I don't know what to do because I realize that there's inequity here. I'm here. God's there, or I'm here, or the nubius is what he calls it in the book. So listen, it's not bad. Problem of pain, still good. All right, we redeem this every now and then. One of the questions I'm asking is, we see in some of the texts, New Testament and in the Old Testament, where intent is okay. You can do a wrong action but right intent, and that's passable. But here, it really doesn't matter what the intent is. They are told repetitively, do not touch the mountain. In fact, put barriers because I will break out against you. What that really means is I'll kill you. That's the word.
But some people, there are a lot of priests there that were very dedicated, and they may have thought, well, I've gone through all the cleansing that I need to do, so why can't I do this? Moses and Aaron are going to do it. I'm just as good as they are because I've gone through all the procedures.
That's exactly my point. That even then it doesn't matter. Do not touch the mountain. And so there is levels of obedience that show up there, regardless if someone has consecrated themselves. What we find inside of this is very specific directions. Moses, I'm going to call you up. You come up. Then I want you to go down. I want the priests to consecrate themselves. I want Aaron to consecrate themselves. You put up a barrier. lest I break out, I break out, I break out, and then you and Aaron come up. And failure to be obedient to the prescription or to the command, it ends in whatever the Lord will break out against you. Now,
don't we believe that the presence of God is in
well,
the church?
all right, good.
Like we sing
Yep.
a hymn that says, "Surely the presence
Sure.
of God is in this place." What's the difference between that presence?
Well, that's part of the reason why I asked the question in the beginning is why isn't intention just enough? Because if God's presence is here, when we consecrate it, we invoke that in our prayer, then why would this presence be any different than any other presence? My answer would be is that the Scripture goes to great detail to sum up exactly where God is, and not with general language. Like when Solomon blesses the temple, he has that long prayer that goes on, "If my people call by," that whole long prayer. That goes on for 2 chapters. The prayer that we quote is just the very end of it. And when he gets through praying, or actually midway through the prayer, smoke starts coming into the temple, and everybody gets afraid. And just imagine, if you're just sitting there, all of a sudden it's not smoke, and all of a sudden smoke comes, and then he says amen, and you know what happens? Fire comes down, and it burns up everything. And so would we say that God's presence was there? Yeah, I think you can make that case in a general sense, but there are certain texts that go to great length to describe presence here. And which then leads me to say that even though people might have good intentions here, it still would end in destruction if they weren't obedient, because there is something different about presence here than it would be just in general presence, if that makes sense.
Is it hard for us to understand because we look at it through the New Testament?
Well, and I think that's the point there. The idea that obviously Pentecost hasn't been given, so we could spend some time on this thought of where actually is the presence of God. Is it limited to just the mountain? Is it limited to the cloud in the daytime and the fire at night? There are times in the Old Testament where it says the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. When we get to if we were to study the Judges, you see where people are given, they are blessed by the Spirit for certain tasks that it seems that they have something with God that's different than the average. Okay, and normally it's for the purpose. A good example would be Gideon, Samson, and then when the task is completed, then it's like it's not. The King Saul, all right, when he's consecrated, Spirit of God is with him. Well, when he violates the consecration, it also says Spirit of God has left him. And then Samuel goes and consecrates David. Spirit of God comes on David, and so that's a good point about how we define presence of God inside Old Testament, because we are highly influenced by the New Testament, and we look back into the Old Testament, which is not bad, but we carry with it certain thoughts, which is why early on when we first started Exodus, one of the things that I said over and over and over is just read the text for what the text says. All right? Be careful not to bring eisegete into the text, be careful not to read into the text what you want it to say. Well, you might be right, okay, but you might not be, or I might not be, and so we want to sit with the text and allow the text to speak for itself, because Exodus doesn't answer every question that we might have. The question of presence, fantastic. The question of obedience, we don't. The question of intention, maybe it is curiosity. Well, then it's just a problem. But maybe it really is pure intention. We don't know, so we can ask the questions and of the text, and then from the information given, try to come to the conclusion, the most probable conclusion that we can have if it doesn't answer it directly or explicitly. Does that make sense? But these are all great questions that, on these ascents going up and down, if you put yourself in the situation, I mean, from our own testimonies, we've had some say, well, I wouldn't care to go up to the mountain. And then we have others say, yeah, I'd be there. So, I would imagine that's probably true of the people there, that there'd be some that saw it and, Moses is talking, goes to Moses, wants to be there next to him. For whatever reason, some, I'd probably be running and hiding. And but what we do know is that there is some repetition that says, do not touch the mountain. And it doesn't matter if you've consecrated yourself or if you have the best intentions, do not touch it. The only two that can are Moses and Aaron. And failure to do so will lead to, I will break out against you. And so we go with that. But that's the third ascent. What we have is, God in all of His holiness, as great and as grand that even in the best intentions and the most sincere of efforts will not make us fit for God unless God deems it. Does that make sense? And which ultimately, when we talk about redemption and God-given grace, I mean, that really doesn't change. The coming, the giving, the dying, and the resurrecting of Christ is all something God does without human endeavor. And so, and what that does, then via that, God makes us fit for His presence. And so we see this here. It doesn't go away. It stays all throughout the rest of the Bible. All right, any questions about the third ascent? All right, now we'll get into something probably we're most familiar with, and that's the Ten Commandments. Now, we don't know how much time between the ascents are. Now, the first three we do know because it gives us information the next morning, on the third day. It gives us some introductory comments there. But when we get to the Ten Commandments, the introduction that we have is, and God spoke all these words, saying. So we might conclude that this is still going on when He goes back up there, and here we go. Some preliminary or general remarks about the Ten Commandments that show up in chapter 20 is that the words originate from God, that it's not Moses, and the God who speaks is Yahweh, the God who brought the people out of Egypt. We see that in verse 2. And the words address a people who were once slaves and have been brought out and have been liberated. We also see that in verse 2 as well. So those are just the general introductory remarks that when we go through and we look at it, this is what we see that at least is going on in the context around it. And so let's, if someone would read maybe verse 1 through the fourth commandment, which would be verse 11. If somebody would do that, we'll stay with those first four first.
Okay, then God instructed the people as follows. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from slavery in Egypt. Do not worship any other gods beside me. Do not make idols of any kind, whether in the shape of figures or you must never worship or bow down to them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not share your affection with any other God. I do not leave unaccomplished. I do not leave unpunished the sins of those who hate me, but I punish the children for the sins of their parents to the third and fourth generation. But I lavish my love on those who love me and obey my commandments, even for 1,000 generations. Do not mistake the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse His name and not misuse it. Remember and observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days a week are set apart for your daily duties and regular work. But the seventh day is a day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day no one in your household may do any kind of work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. Then He rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. Where'd you go?
That's good right there. That's perfect. Thank you. So we've got this, one of the things that you want to just kind of keep in the back of your mind as some parallel scriptures. Deuteronomy 4 is a chapter that's helpful when it comes to Exodus chapter 20 and Leviticus 19. And they follow a similar pattern, particularly Leviticus 19. And so they can give some level of commentary to what's going on here in the Exodus text. Like in Deuteronomy 4:13, what Deuteronomy says is that these are called the 10 words. All right. Now, what's interesting is how does God begin the giving of the commandments to Moses? What is God doing? Speaking. That's exactly right. So he's speaking what? Words. So you can see some of the connection there, which is why in Deuteronomy they call it the 10 words. Each commandment is a self-contained word in and of itself, which means that they're not, what goes on in number 4 isn't the same as what's going to go on in number 5. They're just 10. They're individual and they're self-contained. But they also need to be seen as a complete unit where nothing else is added to it. They're not 11 commandments. They're not 15. They're not 100. They're just 10. When we look at the Leviticus 19 text, if we were to kind of lay up Exodus, if we did Exodus 20 and then we did Leviticus 19, and went through, you could see the parallel connections between them. Now, Leviticus 19 gives you some more insight because it just gives a list of laws that have to do with different themes like domestic law, social law, horticultural law, ritual law, sexual laws, and but what you'll find is that instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4 on down the line, 1 might be here, 2 might be down here, 5 might be here, 6 might be here, but you'll be able to make the connections when you if you were to read both of them. And see the significance of how, not just in Exodus, but inside the Torah. Remember, Exodus sits inside of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And all of them have to do with stemming from, I am the Lord your God. That's what starts this in Exodus 20. In Leviticus 19, that phrase, I am the Lord, do this because I am the Lord your God, shows up 16 times. And so, then if you look at Deuteronomy 4, where it talks about words from the I am, you can see how all of this is connected. You got God speaking, giving the words. Leviticus 19, they show up in law and in the teachings of Leviticus. Most of us in our language, English language, when we hear commandments, it sounds like a demand to submit to authority. Would you agree with that? If that be fair? And for instance, do this because I am the Lord. I'm the one in authority. I do that. You've probably done that with your children, grandchildren, whatever. No, don't do this. Why? Because Grandma said, or whatever, or do this. Why? Because I'm the one in authority. And so we probably start there in our interpretation of the 10 Commandments. But what's also going on here is keep in mind why God has led them to Sinai. Where are they going? That's exactly right. And He's already told them, He's already redeemed them, He's already done so many things. They're coming here to prepare themselves for what? To go and live in this new place. Right. It's exactly right. The first ascent. And so what you have is not just God saying, I'm the one in authority, but God is also saying, live this certain way because I am a certain way. And you are related to me. You're a part. I mean, I've brought you out. I've liberated you. I mean, I've done all this thing, so you're connected to me. So you live the same way that I live. Live this way because I am that I am. Another way of saying that is you must be what you will be because I am what I am. Now, that's a little bit different than just being authoritative. I said it and that's it. All right? Some of y'all were dozing off. I just want to bring y'all back into but it's different. All right? There's something to go back to how you raise children and grandchildren. There are times, I mean, obviously one in authority, okay? But part of what you're teaching is not just that you're the one in authority, but you want them to become a certain way, to be a certain type of people. Why? Well, because they're a part of you. Right, but they're not just love, but they're a part of who you are. I mean, they're a part of your culture, who you are, your identity, everything that makes you who you are. They're a part of that. And so you have God not just lording over them, be careful, I'm going to send lightning bolts down from the mountain and I'm going to zap you. What you have is you're on your way to an area that doesn't look like me. Okay? So on the way from Egypt, they're down here on the mountain, okay? And then eventually they're going to go up and over, up in here, all right? Well, on this journey, they're here on the mountain, which is a time of preparation. Okay? And then to journey over into something that's not me or doesn't reflect me, but I want you to be, so when you get there, it's not easy. You're going to be in a foreign land, for lack of better words. So I want you to figure out who you are here, and who you are is you are to be connected to me. All right, we're in covenant. Remember, we've already looked at that previous week. Spent a lot of time coming out of Passover and how that covenant's renewed over and over and over, leading up to 19 is preparation. And when we finally get, all of this is so when they leave there and they get into promised land, they will reflect covenant relationship. Well, what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like this way of life. So you are to be what you will be because I am that I am, and the law of God reflects the nature of God. And it is the likeness of God expressed in these precepts, and obedience to the law of the Lord triggers in us God's image, which is the nature God wants to develop and regenerate. It shows up here. I mean, we can fast forward into the New Testament. Same thing applies there. So God is speaking, God who brought him out. Notice that long before there's law given, grace has already taken place. You remember last week we looked at how, I think it was last week, where before law is given, there's grace. All right? I mean, the whole redemption, the liberation, all that. And then there's grace provisions all throughout from Egypt to the mountain. Even the warnings is grace. All right? And so grace is all throughout the book of Exodus. Law is given, but it's not giving as lording over. It's given as in, because you're in relationship with me, this is who we're going to be. This is my nature. It's going to be your nature. And then we'll notice the next ascent when he goes up has to do with sacrifice. So what happens when you get it wrong? Well, there's a way for you to be redeemed. So you're not kicked out of the covenant. Does that make sense? Do you see the big picture of what's going on? The law is not to become an oppressor, but to lead to a lifestyle that ultimately will lead to freedom with God. When we don't have to go through all 10 of the commandments right now for you to hear this statement that I'm going to say. The laws value life. They value humans. I mean, and so you can see, and if you were to compare the 10 Commandments to other laws that were written around this time, and even laws that were were written and codified and long before the Ten Commandments were given time-wise, historically speaking, they're very similar. What makes this different is because these laws are the way God gives these laws is that you do these because you are connected to me, that I am part. They're not, now we can look at them and say, oh, these are great, and there are other societies that say, well, don't kill. There are other societies that say, don't steal. There are other societies that say, don't bear false witness or lie. There are other ones that say, don't covet, don't commit adultery. I mean, there's all these things that we could see in other societies. The difference here is that all of this you do because you're connected to God. Whether it's shown up in another culture or not, this is because you're connected to me. I hope that makes sense. Now, there are negative commands, and just like they were in the garden, negative commandments, positive commands only call for that one action. You do this. Negative commands call for any actions but that one. I think we've said this in previous meetings. Once you give somebody, or at least in my household, if I give a negative command, we get fixated on that one negative part. So that's, I don't know why that's the case, but but notice that what you're told to do is just don't do 10 things. Well, you can do a gazillion other actions, just don't do these 10. And that's interesting how we see the negative before we might see the positive. That's not in the text. I'm just asking the question, why is that part of who we are? I would imagine it might be part of them. So any comments or questions thus far about just some general remarks of what we find about the commandments as a whole? Yeah, I mean, well, they're not. It's not bad that they're rules. I think it's, but it's more than just rules. It's right. I mean, it describes a style of life that is directed back towards God. Okay, so what Joanne read, I think you read the first 4, right? I think what Joanne read was the commandments that have to deal with God. They're broken down into 2 segments. The first 4 have to do with God. Commandments 6 through 10 have to do with strictly society. There's a connecting one, which is commandment 5, that has a little bit to do with God and a little bit to do with society. And so that's the structure of the commandments themselves. Notice that they go in they show up in, if we were to look at the first 4, you have thought, word, deed, and this is just commandments 1 through 4. Obviously, commandment 1 and 2 has more to do with thought. Commandment 3 has to do with your words. Commandment 4 has to do with your deeds. And when we get to the ones that have to deal with the society, 5 is kind of a connecting one, but 6 through 10 go in reverse order. They have to do with deed, then back to word, then back to thought. So if you're a math person and you want to analyze it, here it is.
Which ones did you say go back with 6 through 10?
Yes, 6 through 10 have to do with society as a whole. Now, some people, if you read a bunch of commentaries on this, some will put 5 inside the section of society, but the 5th commandment is just it's not as cut and dry as 6 through 10, and so a number of people just leave it as a bridge between the commandments that have to deal with God specifically, and then the commandments that have to deal with other people or society specifically. And so 5 is sort of somewhere in the middle. But you can see the parallelism or the pattern that shows up inside of how this works. Thought, word, deed. Now, if you had to think about how encompassing thought, word, and deed is, that basically covers everything that we are. Correct? All right. So you can see what's going on here. It's not just it'd be great if it was just deeds, then we can think whatever we want, right? And as long as I'm here on time and punch the clock, we're okay. But it really doesn't matter what I think. Or if it's vice versa, if I just had to think real good or make sure that my thoughts are pure, but I could do whatever I want, then I get a free pass. No, this is a little bit of everything. And if you were with us on Wednesday nights, a couple of Wednesdays ago, we spent a couple of weeks around how the tongue and the heart are connected. And think about the commandment 3. Now we're going to look at all these after our break. We're going to take a break in about 5 minutes, and we're going to go through each one of them. But it's think about how what you say, your words are important, can be a violation of what's on the inside of you. That's what I think I'd rather run to the mountain than have to deal with my words. But anyway, but the Ten Commandments are really, the way they're laid out are just fantastic, and but so it does follow some level of structure. Remember when we looked at the plagues? Remember they followed a certain level of structure as well, and so we're gonna try to get through some of the commandments. But let's take a break as we're getting close to our break time. Let's take a break for about 10. or metal or whatever, so it really doesn't matter. And so if Paul is correct in saying that at least with idols, which is supposed to be a representation of a deity, of a god, and that's not real, then do we have other gods or not? Well, okay, you think we do, but we shouldn't. All right, we're going to hold that for just a second because that's a fair question, and that could lead to some jumping off points. That if we want to go down that road, we can. If not, then we won't.
The Hebrews believed there were other gods. They believed
All right.
that God, that Yahweh was their God, and other nations had other gods.
Right. So think of where they came from. Egypt. Remember the plagues? The plagues were on purpose. They dealt with certain parts of the religious structure of the Egyptian just religion, and each plague addressed or tackled a certain deity that had some level, some personification or manifestation of an animal and a human body. That they were all connected, and so in Egypt, there's at least a religious structure that says there are multiple gods. In Canaan, same thing. Now they won't look the same. You don't have the sun god Ra. That's the main deity in Egypt. The sun god is not Ra in Canaan, but both societies are polytheistic. And so, Betty, to your point, which I think is well made, at least they thought or believed that in multiple deities. So either way, the command is it's only one. And there should be no other God. Of course, I think we do live in a world where we make a number of gods because we worship all kind of things. But what's required is undivided loyalty. And there lies the importance. Undivided loyalty to use, I think somebody said earlier, the true God. This is not an admittance that there are other gods or not. That's really not the question. The question is we're going to be loyal to one because there are a fairly large, alluring temptation that constantly exists for the children of Israel, and I would say constantly exists in our day and time, and they can become very menacing. And I mean, we could go through and do a whole list of things that can become gods in our society. Notice the phrase "before me." There shall have no other gods before me. That's an interesting phrase in the Hebrew. It can mean in the presence of, or, for instance, like in Genesis 11, when Haran died, it says he died upon the face of his father, meaning that he died while his father was still alive in his presence. And so it can be before me. That phrase could be no other gods before my presence, or just no other God in the general vicinity. We don't know, but what most people would lead to is that inside of my presence, that it is only one. Right, so that could be an identity statement on behalf of God. I am one. And it can also be a statement that says, inside of my presence, there's no divided loyalties. I mean, it can be both. I mean, the wording is not clear. I mean, if we went and found other examples in the Hebrew, it's not definitive. But both, I mean, for the original reader, they would have known what it is, but both would apply theologically for us. I mean, it fits inside of Old Testament theology. It definitely fits inside of Judaism, fits inside of Christianity. That there are no divided loyalties when it comes to God. Now, so we see that as obviously a command for the people, the original hearers. And obviously, we make the same assumptions, or that we bring the same thing to the text, so that we see that for us. Now, then the question is that we ask of the original hearers: were there divided loyalties for them? Obviously, there would be when they get to Canaan, because we can fast forward into the Judges' time. But what about for us? When it comes to God, are our loyalties divided? It's a question to ask, not to answer. But it's an interesting question. And if so, are there things that vie for your attention, vie for everything that makes you who you are, to the point that that becomes a more controlling entity in your life than it would be for God? And if so, would we not be in violation of commandment number 1? Now keep in mind, we just read about all the seriousness of God's holiness and all the seriousness of the preparation to receive this. And right off the bat, what the call is that to not have any divided loyalties. Just something to ponder. The prayer that I prayed before we started was actually on purpose. We want knowledge, but we want what I call reflective knowledge, where it's not just knowledge or wisdom or something that we don't know, or to reclaim something that maybe we have learned before but forgotten. What we're after is for somehow that to be life infused, a part of who we are. And so when we approach the text and we talk about divided loyalties, we really do have to take this seriously. Because whether or not the gods exist or not, we operate like they do inside of our society and even inside the church. And we could make a list outside of the society easy. We don't need to spend time there. But even inside the church, we have gods. We don't call them gods. We actually call them sacred cows. You ever heard that? They're the same thing. and that becomes, well, actually that probably gets in more of the second commandment. So we're going to move into the second commandment unless there's any more questions about the first commandment. But the call for the first commandment is you are not to have divided loyalties. They're to be it's just one. So we get into commandment 2. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. All right, so what do we think this commandment's saying here? Is it just one thing? Is it 2 things? Is it 3 things? What pops out when you either read or hear the second commandment? All right, so, and 1 and 2 are closely related. So you have that concept of no undivided loyalties there. What does this commandment say about physical things?
It says God is bigger than any physical.
Okay, yeah.
And that you're worshiping the creator instead of the creator.
Sure. Yeah, God is not to be thought of in non-physical or only in non-physical terms, but God is spiritual, bigger than that, metaphysical. But, all right, if that's the case, then should we have physical things or not? For instance, when I walk around the church, I see a lot of pictures of Jesus. I mean, I see a lot. I mean, even that, and I even see paintings that even though God's face, most time whenever there's a painting of God, the Father, the face is not there, except for some places in Rome. But most time the face in paintings are left kind of, just kind of not clear. But it's still fairly, I can make it out. So is that good or bad? Should we have those or not? Because we went to those that went to Spain. There were some really pretty paintings and and the frescoes up there. I mean, it was nice.
There was a certain time in the church that I'm thinking in England in particular, after that, during their Reformation, after Henry VIII, where they just went through and wiped out all of the
burned a lot of it. Yeah.
Burned a lot of beautiful churches. Burned
Sure.
Wiped out all the paintings and took down all those whatever kind of icons they had.
Right. Well.
Totally the way you perceive it as an individual.
Okay, so it's all just personal perception.
Or do you bow down to a picture?
Okay, all right. So now we got into something else. Okay, so you're starting to pick up on what the commandment actually says. First one is non-physical entities. All right, and there's a worship component to that because midway through this commandment, you actually have a twofold aspect, and you are not to bow down. Correct? I mean, isn't that not what the text says? Let's look at it again. You shall not make, all right, so that tells you first, I mean, that's a verb. You should not make for yourself a carved image. And then we get description of that, of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. And you shall not bow. There's two times, and you shall not. So, I mean, this is a compound commandment, for lack of better words. And one of them is you don't make certain things, and which we've talked a little bit about that. And then, but if there are things that are made, you definitely don't bow down to them. So you have where Sally said about the God and mammon, the undivided loyalty. But we use things all the time. Who mentioned icons? Iconography? Icons. In the Orthodox Church, the icons are used all the time, and they're used very effectively. And we have icons around our church. Now we don't bring them in for symbolism and worship. Well, we do one. We bring the flame, and then we bring the cross in. All right. Some higher churches, higher liturgical churches, will bring in the Bible in worship. But even if you walk around the church, now you can take out the stained glass windows because the stained glass windows, at least in their origin, were used for teaching. Public education is very late, and so looking at stained glass window, they could tell the gospel story. When y'all travel and you go into the old cathedrals or things like that, and you see the benches, and they've carved all these things, and and how they might tell the entire Old Testament story, or they might tell the story of that church or the story of Jesus. So they are images, but the rationale for the images is that it's a teaching. It's a means by which to teach. But they're still images that were made.
What about reverencing the altar?
Okay, right. Keep going.
Well, I'm just thinking, we in the Methodist Church reverence at the altar, but we do not kneel before the altar.
Yeah, you're not genuflexing when you come in. Yeah, I mean, you're not.
When I said it's the way you perceive it, maybe some people do think of that as, and they are actually worshiping it.
Right.
The other things in the church, I mean, some individuals, you just feel that it is a way of being reverent.
Right.
And when
So how you approach them, would you say that's a better? Okay. Well, I would agree with you. I'm not disagreeing because later on when we get to when they're forming the tabernacle, and there's very specific rules on how to build certain things. Obviously, the Ark of the Covenant, you have to build the seat a certain way, you have to build a bronze altar a certain way, and then you consecrate them. And the way they consecrate them is they'd kill the bull and they'd take some of the blood and do a wave offering. They'd take it and just kind of wave it out over it, and that made it God's. That's God purchasing it. and then it became holy and a physical representation for where God would be. And so we use symbols all the time. The issue is, do they become in your worship divided loyalties? And if they do, then, go back to the statement I made, they become more than sacred cows. It becomes idolatry.
Could it also mean, rather than literally the way this sounds, sometimes in our lives other things become more important?
Sure.
Like baseball tournaments on the weekend, or things like that.
So then
Could
it
not also
yeah.
mean that
Well,
putting those things before?
yeah, it doesn't have to be just things in the church. I mean, we were talking specifically about things in the church, but there are a ton of things that can become gods or forms or symbolism of certain gods. And, when we get to Sabbath, that is a very good question. I mean, why Sabbath is important and why Sabbath is mentioned inside the list that directly relate to God Himself. Okay? Because He could have easily said, balance your time well. Thou shalt have a good calendar. But He doesn't. He relates time back to Himself. And so, because anything, physical or non-physical, can become a god. And the bowing obviously is a worship motion, okay? But there are whether or not someone literally bows to something is not an indication for worship. Obviously, physically, it's a sign of reverence, sign of respect, sign of authority to someone else. I mean, we can go down the line of what bowing has meant inside of religious practices all throughout the ages. But the bigger issue is that bowing is, in some form or another, worship. And worship becomes the means by which you show allegiance. Or I mean, for the most part, that's it. And they could look differently, but and anything can be that. Things outside the church, things inside the church. I remember somebody telling me this years ago, and when I was in seminary, and at first I really didn't get what they were saying, and then the more I thought about it, I thought, yeah, that's pretty good. Said that in the ancient world, they were just really honest with their deities. They were everywhere, and there were, just as there are churches on every corner here, there were places for people to worship on every corner there. It might be this goddess, it might be this god, it might be this. A city might have the city like Ephesus was Aphrodite. All right, so she had the biggest temple in there, but there wasn't the only temple. Okay, and so there'd be all kind of other areas for people to worship, and people were practiced syncretism. They would go and worship with Aphrodite for sure, but then they would catch all the other ones on the way back just to sort of cover their bases. They wanted something, so they would go and worship. And we've talked previously about how people worship, and they would just do that. And so there were all these places everywhere for them to go and to worship, to give of themselves, and they were very honest with that. The difference between the ancient world, and this is what the person told me, the difference between the ancient world and the world we live in is we're just dishonest with it. We hide it. And so there are a ton of things that vie for our loyalties. And whether we're literally bowing down or not really doesn't matter. If it consumes you and dictates your life, remember what the Ten Commandments do. I am this way, you're connected to me, so you live this way as a natural progression of being connected to me. So if which means that I'm going to be conformed to the God that I worship. Well, what does that God look like? Well, He looks like this. Well, if I'm, what happens if I'm conformed to, what was the Roman god Bacchus? Do you know that god? All right. That is not a problem for our society. Right? I didn't think so. Well, what happens if over time that becomes the deity where your allegiance sits? Well, before long, your day will rotate around Bacchus. And so the saying that says it's 5 o'clock somewhere might not be good. Correct? I mean, other... Sure. Mm-hmm. All right, so you used the word validation. That's a good word. It's a modern word, but it's a word that's tied to identity. Well, 10 Commandments are given to help describe identity of the people. They are to be this way. This is their identity because God's this way. That's His identity. And so, I mean, that's a great word that is used there. And, most of us will beat up on the things that we know outside of the church that we know can be deities, all right? And we like to, you've heard 1,000 sermons on them. But what about the person that serves so much in the church that it wrecks their family? Now, which one is worse? Okay? What's that? Right, okay. I mean, what about the person that, contorts their body physically with exercise, and so that it becomes who that's how they define themselves. All right. Okay. I mean, I'm just talking about some good things. Okay. What about the person who works 80 hours a week? You know what happens? They get promoted, and they normally end up making more money. And yet they sacrifice their health and their family, okay? So there are a ton, naturally, I think y'all have picked up on this, we don't mind beating up on the things that we know society wants to beat up on. We can get on the bandwagon. Reflective learning is about, to some degree, being honest with everything to see if that ends up being our loyalty. And there might be even good things. Things that, if kept in balance, are very productive and can lead to all kinds of transformation and growth with God, maturation in faith. But even something, as Joanne pointed out, even something that can be good, if we're doing it because it's going to give us a certain identity, and if that identity formed is different from the identity God wants to form, then how is that not an idol? Right. I mean, I would agree. I think it is too. I mean, nobody in this room, and I'm serious, it's not a joke now, but there have been times where I've mentioned to people, said, you don't need to be up here so much. Seriously, I mean, the church is going to make it. Sometimes I have to say that to myself, all right? John, other folks, devoted lay people. I mean, it's part of, take a vacation. It's okay. I mean, but it's something that there are wonderful things that can be very helpful. But fast forward back to Matthew 15. In the worship with different pots and pans, or even with money. Part of the thing that Jesus gets on to some of the Pharisees is that they'll put all their money in a trust, a religious trust, but they're the executor. All right? And so they could exclude helping family members because they have to give all their money to the Lord. That's the critique in Matthew 15. Okay? And it happened all the time back in that day. And so, You got people that, Jesus calls them out and says, you do all these things. The actions from the outside look real good. But on the inside, it's a divided loyalty. How's that any different than someone that says, well, sorry, honey and kids, I can't be home because I need to be up at the church till midnight.
What'd you say, Matthew what?
15. Another one, Mark 7. That's with the pots and pans and the washing. Matthew 15 is about worship, and then he quotes Isaiah in both places. What is it? You worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me.
Shane, I've always had trouble with the poor prisoner who is asked to recant his religion or be beheaded.
Right.
And that would pose a huge problem. Maybe God wants me to live so I can tomorrow preach somewhere else. But I don't know how that would work.
Say more so I know 100% what you're asking. If someone recanting as if to...
You're a prisoner of
Right.
jihad.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't recant your religion,
Right, you could be, yeah,
it
or
would be hard to.
sure.
You could cross your fingers, but they.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's been around. That's not just something that's modern. I mean, the persecutions that took place in the early church, they martyred people in masses, and some were faithful, some were, some did not recant. I don't want to use the word faithful. Some did not recant, and some did. And later on, if they made it through the persecution, it showed up in. It's called the Donatist Schism, if you want to look it up. And it's Augustine was the heavyweight theologian that had to deal with that. North Africa, there was a time of persecution under the Roman government and the empire. And some people did not recant and they died, and some people did and they were able to live. Well, when the emperor died and the persecution ceased, the people that lived wanted their jobs back inside the church. And, the ones who didn't, who went through, who either family members died or lived in prison or whatnot, basically said, there's no way in the world you're getting this job back. And some places they did get their job back. And so then they started to argue about, well, the person who recanted, who's now a minister, whatever he does, it's not effective. Baptisms and things like that. And what Augustine basically came out and said is that's not for you to determine. That it's up to God. And obviously when it came to sacraments, it's not a human deal. There's human action in it, but it's a heavy God thing. And so whether or not somebody recants or not, I don't. It's hard to answer that question because you don't know. What about the person that recants or doesn't recant and they die? And what about, but 2 seconds before the knife blade hit the neck, they had different thoughts, or the person that doesn't recant, and then down the road they confess. So I don't, those type of questions are, there's not an answer to some degree. And now we like that because we like absolutes. And if we can, and we do that with theology all the time, if I can form it and get it down, then I can stick it in my cubbyhole and I don't have to worry about it anymore. And that's okay. That can be very helpful for a period of time. But at some point in time, inside of somebody's life, there's going to be an incident that will it will land blast the theology, and so then you got to figure out what you're going to do then, and so to answer your question, until you're in that situation, I wouldn't even worry about it. I don't mean that ugly. Yeah. Well, because what you have, I mean, now, if we stopped here, okay, this is also a commandment that has a punishment with it. All right? And the first one did not. The second one does. Remember what it says? It says, the people that curse you, this is going to happen. There's something to that. And if we stopped here and that's all we had of the book of Exodus, then I think the question you ask is probably one that should be at the very forefront of our mind all the time. But as we move through the book of Exodus, you're going to find a sacrificial system. Well, what's the purpose of the sacrificial system? If you break one of these, there's a means by which you can be restored. And so I'm not dismissing it because it's a great question to think about and to use it as a means to study. But there's so many things that we just do not know. I mean, how many of you, be honest, fully know everything of your life? Are there not things that, is everything tied off in a nice bow? Probably not. And that's probably the only place that we would know the most about. So when we start to think about someone else's life, that gets into just so many unanswered questions that, it's okay in the ivory tower to have those conversations, but the way that gets played out in practical life, I would always caution people just to, don't be quick to answer the question. The good news, and this is clear in the New Testament, is that it's not up to us anyways. So, when we read the New Testament, who's the judge? Jesus. All right? And so, good on him. But I'm serious. We don't know. And I just would, what's faster, a thought or a bullet? Seriously. Or a thought or a knife blade. We don't know. And I know we'd like to go to parts where we say, well, you got to confess with your mouth and believe in your heart. What about if someone's deaf and a mute and they can't hear, they can't speak? How are they going to confess with their mouth? All right. So I'm just saying that sometimes when we try to put something in this nice little pigeonhole and just park it up here so that we don't have to think about it again, that's okay, and that'll be good for the majority of our life situations. But there are going to be these times that show up over longer seasons that's going to call some of that into question. And on a larger scale, the Ten Commandments are given to help form and to solidify identity for the people, because they are going into Canaan where there are going to be times where all that is called into question. And so what do? It might be easy on the mountain because there's no temptation. We're here in the presence of God. It's fantastic, wonderful. I got the little barrier here. I don't have to go to the mountain. It's all good. Moses, we already elected him to be the mediator, so he goes up, and if it doesn't work for him, I'm in my tent, so I can't, I'm all right. Aaron, he'll help him out, so I'm good. At some point, you get in the ball game, and they're going to be in Canaan, and there's going to be the conquest took, decades and decades and decades and decades for them to possess the land. The idea that thinks that they just walk through that without any problems, no, it doesn't. And so but the commandments work to help form that identity, and which leads them then to live into what God would desire for them. I do want to get to Commandment 3 real quick. We got about 2 minutes. When we get to Commandment 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. The profession of mouth is an aspect of adoration in worship. Just like bowing is a physical gesture that reveals worship, profession of mouth reveals worship. And the name of God is, remember, the name Yahweh is not the name for God. It's not. The name of God, they wouldn't utter it because it was so intimate and so holy, so they came up with another word that said, when I say Yahweh, I really mean that name. That name's lost. We don't know what that is. And so Yahweh is, it's don't go too far with this, but the nickname. What was that? The alias, yeah, exactly right. But the name of God, so intimate, so holy, and so to use it in any other way other than with reverence is to profane it. Is to lessen it. What's that? Sure. To misuse it is to profane it. It's insulting. Notice that commandments 2 and 4 and 5 have extra writing to it. Now, we already looked at some of that. Some of it is punishment or some commentary. To take the name of God in vain, to use it other than inside of a time of worship or a time of showing loyalty, showing adoration to, is to violate its essence. So it's important. Now, we already talked about how what we say is somehow connected to our heart. Now, we know that from the book of James. We know that from the Gospels. You can also make, you can make the same jump here, that what you say in some form or fashion reveals where your loyalties sit, since that's been the term we've been using to describe the commandments, at least commandment 1 and 2. And so you see a portion of this here. So we've moved from thought to word, and then next week we're going to pick up with Sabbath. And I want to spend a lot of time on Sabbath because I think it's a huge problem in our society. So I just want us to, we're going to get through, the other ones are once, and let me give you some insight into how the rest of the book will go. 19 and 20, and you got 3 or 4 chapters that are just have so many springboards. When we leave the 10 Commandments, what we'll do after that in just a few weeks, you'll have to deal with just big, large segments of thought, and we're not going to read every verse because it's you might have 2 chapters on what the garment should be for the priest, all right, or the dimensions for the carpenters to build something. Well, I mean, you can talk about that in theme. Now, you can go. So I'm going to ask you to read them ahead of time, and we'll spend time speaking about them and looking at them that way. But it's like when you read in Numbers. Well, of the tribe of Benjamin, and it gives you all the numbers. I mean, that's important, but what it tells you is that people are important. Okay, so that's the lesson, and we find some of that in Exodus when we get to the latter part. We're going to highlight a few, but some we're just going to cover in some large segments that we're not going to read every verse because you can read that on your own, and there's no, the wording's straightforward. If it says make a block, take a piece of wood, cut it, make it this way. It's not. It is what it says. So, anyways, any comments before we finally dismiss? All right. May the Lord be with you. Go in peace. Oh.